Wow. Sorry about the volume.
And now that we have your attention.
Exactly. Sorry.
It's probably not loud for my class. All right, should we begin? All right, well, welcome everyone to the Doctoral Education Colloquium here at Drexel University. My name is Christy Kelly, and I'm super excited to be moderating today. We're so pleased to welcome all of our attendees, both on campus and those of you online. And I realize all you can see is my shoulders, and I will move back here a little bit. The Doctoral Student Colloquium series offers the School of Education students an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one EDD student or graduate and one PhD student or graduate presents their research at the Colloquium, which is both offered on campus and via Zoom. These sessions help doctoral students to connect with each other and develop a peer community that's invaluable. So thank you all for participating today. I'm very excited to be presenting two of our students today. One is a graduate. Our first is Amanda Rainsborough, who will be presenting some preliminary research results from a study that is ongoing in a 5th grade classroom. Amanda is a PhD student, and we're excited to have her present. She'll have about 20 minutes or so, leaving time for Q&A. And then we will move on to our second presenter, who is Dr. Chris Holland. He is a veteran teacher of 13 years experience in both public schools and independent schools, and he will be presenting his research on educators' dualistic perceptions of leadership styles during pre-K independent school accreditation. Dr. Holland, we're happy to say, graduated this past spring, and so we're excited to have him back to present his research to all of you. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Amanda.
All right. Copy over there. All right. Hi, thank you guys for coming. I'm going to talk about doing math, some information from a 5th grade classroom where the teacher is using centers to help develop students' math skills and math literacy. I was invited to participate in this study right around the beginning of the school year. Maybe? Maybe not. We're not going to click. It's okay.
There.
All right. Yay. All right, so agenda, I'm not going to read through that, but ultimately, this quote kind of stands out to me. Doing mathematics should always mean finding patterns and creating beautiful and meaningful explanations. This is sort of like the goal of the work we want the students to do in the centers that I'm going to describe. And so we really want them to understand math and be able to use the work that they're doing. So I have a few things that I'm going to define as we go through this. Doing math, math skills, math literacy, and centers. You've actually heard me say all of those words already. And so you'll kind of get an understanding of what that means as we go through the slides. So we'll start with math skills. Math skills are the things that we teach kids in classrooms, right? It's sort of what our standards are built on. And in 5th grade, it looks like this. They have to understand place value. They have to use operations with multi-digit numbers, decimals, fractions, and they have to do order of operations and convert some measurements. That's from the Common Core state standards for 5th grade. However, that doesn't always match up with the math literacy skills that we talk about. So math literacy as defined by the Organization for, and now I lost my words, Economic Cooperation and Development. I always forget the words that happen there. They talk about individuals being able to use, formulate, employ, interpret mathematics in a variety of contexts, and then use that information and the role math plays in the world. And so we see a lot of news stories and data out there that are saying, well, the US isn't really meeting these standards and they're not gaining any ground. Actually, PISA was just, the scores were just released from 2018. And so there is that same conversation happening yet again. And so the idea is, how do we bridge this space from math skills to math literacy? And the idea is to use centers to do this intentional use of mathematics spaces so that kids get the chance to actually do some math in these. So our centers that we have designed for this classroom are designed to create experiences for doing mathematics through the use of concrete counting and measuring, right? So they're going to count the things that they're doing and they're going to measure some stuff. And they're going to do this with the objects that we see in math problem solving. So all math problem solving, almost every problem we do, has one of these 9 quantities in it. So it's either individual objects, linear distance, area, weight, volume, time, angles, money, or temperature. So it doesn't matter what problem you read, it will have something to do with it. So like if they're doing something with counting blocks, that's an individual object. And so in up through 5th grade, in kindergarten through 5th grade, they kind of work with these like independently. Like we'll work on volume one time, and then we'll work on temperature another time. Once they hit 6th grade, they start to make relationships between these ideas. And so we want to solidify their understanding of all of this prior to getting there. So our centers are intentionally designed to do this work. So let's look at the centers just kind of and think about them in relation to what that means problem solving wise. So if I think about math skills and how students, how we think about math skills in the classroom, there's sort of like this problem here. What is the difference between 3600ths and 2500ths? Very basic, very simple calculation. I just have to subtract them. However, when we think about a problem from a math literacy perspective, it sort of looks like this. Okay, so here we have to read the whole problem. We have 2 people, they have some rice, they want to know who has more. They are using a graduated cylinder. If I don't know what this is, that doesn't make any sense to me. And then it's important to note that Marcus has 2500ths of a liter, whereas Sam has 360 milliliters. So the literacy piece comes in here and being able to see the difference that there's liters and milliliters, I gotta do something with that. And I picked these numbers so that ultimately we would end up with the same thing here. And so while the work is very similar, this problem looks drastically different than this one. And so the centers that we're asking kids to participate in allow us to have them measure volume, to use a graduated cylinder, to know that a liter is bigger than a milliliter. That like ultimately, if I wanted to hold something in my hand, I can hold a milliliter of rice, right? I can't really put a liter of rice in the palm of my hand. I use rice because if I think about water, usually we measure liters in water, right? Well, if I put that in the palm of my hand, I have water everywhere, which kids would do if we let them. So this is kind of the idea of what is our research is kind of looking at. So the problem is that students have to be able to use math skills in a context that promotes math literacy. However, when the skills are taught, they're often presented in a space of isolation, which means the connection between the concepts isn't built in a way that allows them to transfer that skill knowledge into an applicable space. So they also need to be doing work that not only builds the skills, but also the vocabulary and understandings necessary to utilize those skills. We're looking at, by participating in these centers designed specifically to do this work, that students can bridge these 2 structures between skills and literacy. The purpose is to understand how math skills and math literacy develop as these 5th grade students participate in the centers that were intentionally designed to promote their doing mathematics. There are multiple research questions that will be addressed throughout this study. Today, I am just talking about how do centers designed for students to count and measure change their understandings of mathematics. So I'm really just focusing on giving you some preliminary information on this first question that we're looking at. This research is guided by 2 theoretical frameworks. The first is Schoenfeld's work on reflecting on what doing mathematics in the classroom should look like. And the second is Hilberg, Chang, and Epelouse's report from the Center for Research on Education, Diversity, and Excellence that looks at how activity centers should be structured to allow kids to engage in math. So Schoenfeld was describing the work of many of his peers in this article that I was reading and looking at, because at the time they were looking to define the state of mathematics learning and teaching. In 1983, we had the release of the report A Nation at Risk, which kind of changed the way we looked at education. So this is 11 years later, but we're still, they're still trying to shape what that looked like in the math classroom. And so he was saying, doing mathematics is a sense of sense making, or an act of sense making. Mathematical communication is important. We have to be able to talk about it. The mathematical community grapples with serious problems collaboratively. So we as a community work together. Why aren't our kids working together? And then learning math is empowering. You gain something from that. So it was important to this kind of undergirds the work that I'm doing. When we talk about activity centers, this work kind of talked about how do we structure these centers. So as joint productive activity, the kids are working together, language and literacy development, contextualization, making sure that they understand context of problems, challenging activities, and then instructional conversation. So the teacher has to be part of the work that's happening. They don't have to be the only person doing the work. So these kind of frame the characteristics of the centers that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the centers that the students are doing in the classroom now. Oh, I'm sorry, this design of the study will come first. So this is happening in Philadelphia in a charter school in a 5th grade math classroom. So I am observing a 5th grade teacher. She teaches all 5th grade math, but I'm only observing what is called the multi-tiered system of supports class, or MTSS class. So how this works is there are 3 classes that cycle through this, and she sees them 2 days in a row. So if she sees class A on Monday and Tuesday of this week, she won't see them again until Tuesday and Wednesday of the following week. So it kind of is a cycle that works like that, just to give you kind of an understanding of how we go through that process. So the school demographics, is important to note that this school is about 94% Black. 73% of the students are low income. It's a good mix of male and female students. And then there's about 12% of those students who are special education. And we do see those students in the MTSS class. So they work a little bit differently through some of the centers that we're doing. The preliminary methods, or what I'm going to share with you today, are based on observations I've been doing for about the last 12 weeks. I've been in the classroom approximately 2 days a week. But in the future, I intend to collect more data from observation student work, some teacher and student interviews, and then we're going to look at the PSSA scores when they come out and compare this year's with last year's and see how growth changes because they've been exposed to this work. Going into the classroom, I wanted to think a little bit about who I was in this space. So I was a math teacher for 10 years, so I bring that into everywhere I go. But I also taught students who were struggling learners, and so became a student advocate very quickly. How do we help them gain more knowledge in this space? I also became a teacher advocate because we need to give teachers time to help those kids do those things, right? They need to have the space to make that happen. When I started my master's program, I started to think about research and actually where you find it and how you use it, because I didn't ever do that before. And then coming into this program has really helped solidify some of my thinking and thoughts on the research I want to do. And then through this, I've been able to become a teacher educator. So I've worked with undergrad and master's classes and helping students kind of find their place in teaching and education. And so all of these things kind of situate myself as a participant observer within the classroom, right? I am not just sitting in the back of the room watching what's happening. I'm talking to students, interacting with groups. They feel comfortable with who I am. They listen to what I have to say. They ask me questions. I can ask them questions. And so it works out really well that I can gain knowledge of what's happening in the classroom from that space. So we have started 3 different centers in this classroom. I'm going to start with the one we started most recently and kind of work to the one I'm going to talk more about. So most recently, we started talking about multiplication and division fact families. All the centers are set up where they have 3 little columns they have to fill in here. So this one's talking about the number of groups, the amount in each group, and then the total. So for example, I have jars here. That's my group. I have 5 jars. The amount in each group is how many cubes are in each one of those jars. They do all have the same number. I'm going to assume it's 10. So that would be like 5, 10, and then the total would be 50. I'm doing a multiplication there. And so they're going to go through that and then do some additional things with it. The center, another center we've been working on is very similar to the math literacy problem that I presented earlier, where they actually have to measure how much rice is in these little cups. They're asked to make a prediction first. They measure container A and container B, then they find the difference between that. They're measuring in liters so that their answer will be a decimal. and then they're doing some additional work with that. So they're using the graduated cylinder. When we started this, they didn't know what that was. Now they can all talk to you about what that is. And the one I'm going to present the most information about today is this addition and subtraction fact families. So this is what we started with first. These fifth grade is about kids understanding big numbers, right? Numbers in the millions, what does that look like? And so they're given these little chips, and they are counter chips. They have 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 on them. And they're asked to create the number that represents the chips that they're given. So they're thrown on the desk like this, and they can do whatever they want with them. So this kid made rows. This student stacked them. Some students just go, oh, I have the ones. I'm just going to pick up all the ones and then put them in the baggie. And then I'm going to pick up all the 10s. So they all use different methods to do this. And so it's interesting to see the work that's happening in that space. By the way, this number over here, the one in the middle, is 4,410,466. What's interesting about that is they did not leave space for that 0 where the 1,000s are, right? There's a 0 in the 1,000s position. So they didn't leave that space, but who knows what they actually wrote on their paper, because I don't have that information, but this would be that number. And so that is one of the challenges I will talk about in just a minute. So as I said, all the centers start out with them having to do these first 3 things. That isn't all that they do. So then they have to write narrative sentences about each one of the numbers in the boxes. They have to create the fact family for those 3 numbers. And then they have to use the sentences that they created to write problems based on the fact family. So I'm going to show you an example, because that's a lot of information right there. So I made up some numbers. Mine, 1,325,261. Yours, 4,043,027. So altogether, 5,368,288. So that part, once we've got to the point for them writing down the numbers, not so bad. So the number sentences are, I have that many subscribers to my YouTube channel. You have this many, and together we have so many, right? So we're able to write they don't have to be long, crazy descriptive sentences. They just have to be 3 basic sentences that represent the numbers. Then a fact family is just the first 2 things added together. Mine plus yours is ours. I can add the other way. Yours plus mine is ours. And then the subtraction parts of the fact family. Fact families are usually thought about when we talk about single-digit numbers. So getting to do this can be a little bit complicated. And then you write a word problem. So this is the word problem going with the last member of the fact family. So together there are 5,368,288 subscribers to our YouTube channels. If I have 1,325,261, yeah, something like that. How many do you have, right? So that would make me do this work over here. And so they're starting to write those sentences. That's the goal of this center, is that they can then create these word problems, which is kind of like the word problems they might see on a test. So let's take a look at some of the preliminary observations that I have seen within this classroom based on this center. Writing the number is challenging from those chips. It can be a little bit difficult. So right up here, so every kid has a different system. Some students do this work where they write all of the things down, but they didn't initially do this, right? They needed a little prompting to say, well, if you have 1 million chips, don't you have 3 million? What does that look like when you write it down? So we started to get some of that. So some of the students still do this part of it. So up here on the right, you kind of see, or left, sorry, that this is correct and accurate. We get an accurate number. We do as well here, but I circled this 13,000 because that 13 meant that they had 13 1,000 chips. So 13 of those things with 1,000 on them, right? So while this is correct, the question is, do they know that 10 of those would give me another 10,000? So some students will actually manipulate if they have 10 and move it over to where the next higher place value is. So it's interesting to see the way they think about creating these numbers. And then, do we see the issue with the last one over here? Right, this kid thinks they have 600 1 million chips. So somehow they wrote this down wrong. ultimately they get a completely different answer than what you would have done if you did that addition. I think they realized that they had some extra zeros, but I can't say that for sure, but that would be my assumption. So then when we talk about writing the narrative sentences, writing a sentence about things you can have millions of can be a little difficult, right? They wrote something, I have 1 million shirts. Really? You have 1 million shirts? That seems a little bit strange. So we had the teacher had a whole conversation about what does it mean to have 1 million of something? And so they talked about books, and we asked where would there be 1 million books? We talked about money. What would you spend $1 million on? Like what kinds of things? They have lots of ideas. It's 5th grade, they have tons of ideas. Viewers and subscribers, and that's why I put it in my other piece. Viewers and subscribers is super interesting because that is a generational thing, right? Not something I maybe would have thought of, although I do know what it is. It's not like in the forefront of how I think about stuff. So they are very excited to share that one. And then Dojo points is up there because they do use Class Dojo in this classroom, and I don't know who gives 1 million points, but they thought that was important to have in their list. And so their writing of their narrative sentences has changed drastically over the last 12 weeks. In the beginning, they didn't really know what we meant by narrative sentences. These are not wrong. They're telling me what they did, but they're not telling me about their numbers, right? I added all of my digits. I got my friend's number. I added both our numbers to get ours. Okay. I mean, that's what you did, but that's not really what we were asking. So we had to do more explanation of what we meant by narrative sentences. To get now, they're talking about like the number is. I got the number. So they talked about what the numbers were. So finally moving to, we're going to give some context to that number and we're going to call it some money, right? So that has changed over time. They're getting better with context around their sentences. And then, you know, like we could be nitpicky and talk about capitalization or periods. And I always write that stuff on their papers, but I don't, like they're not graded on that. So then fact families, I said a little bit about this earlier. Some students immediately got that I could write that fact family, but some students needed this piece to understand the process of what the fact family looked like. Fact families are talked about up through 5th grade, but sometimes the conversation gets lost a little bit. So we needed to have more conversation about that. Some still struggle with the subtraction ones, and we'll end up putting like 4 million minus 5 million gives me this one, not realizing that the order is incorrect. And then, but they don't know about negative numbers yet, so we can't really have too crazy a conversation there. And then when they write their word problems, we saw big changes happening there. So this one, they tell me what the two numbers are, which is bigger and by how much. So while that may be an accurate way to write that, it might not be an accurate way that they would see it written in a word problem that they might see on a test. So we asked them to rewrite and rethink about how they're writing that. And the second one, this kid's talking about strands of hair, right? Whoever his partner or her partner was talking about strands of hair, which is actually kind of interesting because you could have millions of strands of hair, although I don't know that you want to count them. But it was relevant to their world in that day. And by the way, their hair falls out, which is even more interesting. And then this student down here is talking about donating money. And so I don't know if, not positive that I'm going to make an assumption that they had a conversation about this in class. In some class they have about donating money. Because I saw it on I saw a few kids doing this, but it was interesting to see that they're then, the context changed drastically over the course of the 12 weeks that the students were doing this work. So we think about the significance of what's happening in the work that they're doing in these like intentionally designed centers for them to really think about doing math. The students are counting and measuring things to give them access to math in an authentic way, right? They're not just doing a problem, they have to do some work to get there, and they're creating problems. They're building their vocabulary and using items they may not use in any other way, right? A graduated cylinder, liters, milliliters. They're measuring with meter sticks and not calling it a yardstick, right? They're two different things. And so there's lots of good conversation happening in that space. And they're writing their own word problems that they could possibly see on a test. The idea is to give them as many tools as we can to help them do better in mathematics. So they're doing math. The teachers are able to easily identify successes and challenges within the students' work. They're able to move fluidly around the room while the students are working. They can provide remediation both to individual students or to a whole group of students that are having a challenge, while other students are independently able to work on these centers. And they can see growth and development over time, right? So I can say, well, in the beginning, the student struggled with this, but I can see the range of how they've grown through this. So they're more than just facilitators, because they're not just kind of teaching it to them and then giving it to them to do on their own. They're part of the process, but they're not taking over what the kids are doing. So it kind of looks like this. This is sort of what we would think about as a math classroom, right? There's rows, the teacher's up here talking, kind of like I'm doing right now. And the students are kind of listening, but it's a one-way direction, right? But then we want to move to classroom B. We want to move to a space where the kids are having good mathematical conversations together to learn more about the skills and literacy they need. And the teacher is moving to have conversations with a student or have conversations with a group, but can fluidly move around the room to make sure that kids are gaining this knowledge in an authentic way. As we look to the future of what this will look like, we're going to get student growth. So how do specific students develop over time? So there'll be some like specific deep dives into individual student work. How does teacher feedback to the students affect what they're doing? So what does it look like? Has it helped? So we are doing some feedback work, and that is developing as we continue with the center work. We're gonna look at state assessment data, and then what has emerged from looking at some of their student work and hearing the kids talk in class, kind of what does that mean to give students open access to use their own context, right? Subscribers, strands of hair, what does it mean when they get to think about this from a place that makes sense to them? So this is kind of the next steps in this work within the classroom. I want to say thank you to Miss Capione, the 5th grade teacher I've been able to observe. She lets me come into her class, and she's more than willing to work with me. Dr. Ellen Clay, whose idea this is, she has designed these centers and has worked really hard to move forward with this work, and I appreciate her inviting me to be part of this research. Dr. Valerie Klein for listening to me talk about all of this. My cohort and all the members of the PhD community who are here and part of what has been going on. I have some selected references, and I can take questions if anybody has them.
We have about 2 minutes for questions, so I apologize. If we could just take a couple questions, and then maybe while we're setting up the next person, that would be working well, and I can look online.
So does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
The doing math part.
Yeah.
Was there a specific reason why you chose to use the term doing math as opposed to another?
Ultimately, because the students are physically doing the work. And so I guess I need to stress that a little bit more. It's not just about them solving a problem. It's about them physically doing work to understand mathematics. So they actually have to measure, they have to count, they have to create. And so they're doing something to make that happen. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and I only ask because there's a classification by Mary Stein that actually does the classification of doing math versus connections with procedures with connections.
Yep. We've talked about that. Anybody else? Yeah.
Question about the how students are applying their skills.
Yep.
And I missed the very beginning of the
That's okay.
so my apologies for that. Has there been any thought to looking at having students actually construct things and utilize their math skills while constructing? So maybe over a quarter, whether it be a small building, a boat, something that they would actually be physically creating while employing their math skills, and that in turn would also use other
all of those other
disciplines.
Yep.
And also with that, Math always seems to get the shortest amount of time compared to other subjects. Has there been any thought to doubling the amount of time of math and I hope there's not language arts teachers. Reducing the amount of language arts time because the students will end up learning to read through math. So we're not actually reducing the language arts. No, my apologies.
Yeah.
But,
So no to that part. The building thing is a great idea. We have not thought about that, but you're right. When kids get the chance to use their math skills to build something, it does help them out. This school does, like I said, they kids have math for 90 minutes. So this is set up as they have like 3 classes a day: math, language arts, and then science/social studies is their other class. So science and social studies are sort of like, they get half and half time there. And then they do this multi-tiered MTSS class. So they do get a lot of math time. And I don't always know that more math time is better math time or helps them. Sometimes it's just more math time, right? Like not always from a good way. Yeah.
More participants.
Yeah. So we have not thought about that. This is new. This is new for the school in this space at this time, and so we'll see how it develops over time. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but one thing I think that's really neat about those spaces is the nature of like what are the closed-ended parts of the task and what are the open-ended ones. And I think it would be neat to talk about how that may or may not have been deliberately done, or which surprises are creating opportunity to see the student thinking.
Yeah.
Behind the like very well structured focus on keeping it good.
Yeah. That's because there's a lot of like while the question is asking them to write sentences, it's very open-ended for their context space. But you know, like it's hard to figure out how to have 3 or 4 sentences, 3 or 4 centers going on in a classroom at the same time, where the kids are sort of self-sufficient in different spaces without having to ask a million questions. So there's a lot of things that affect what they're doing in that space. But you're right, like looking at the difference between the open and closed-ended pieces would definitely add to this. Thank you. I can answer more questions afterwards, but I want to give our next presenter time.
Thank you, Amanda. And for those of you that are joining us, let me briefly introduce Dr. Chris Holland, who is a recent graduate of the EDD program here in the School of Ed, and we're excited for him to present a tiny slice of his dissertation. Please hold your questions till the end. If you're online, please chat any questions. We'll stop at 1, but since both of our presenters are here in person, people are willing and eager to continue the conversation. We'll carry on afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First, thank you so much for inviting me back. Feels good to be home. So I'm here to present kind of a little bit of my dissertation. I don't want to present the whole thing because it's massive. So I'm going to present one of my findings, one of my themes that have emerged from my data. And in particular, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of the work that I did, and then move a little bit more to some of the focus that we're going to work with today. And then I'm going to present some of the findings about that key theme and kind of bring everything together through the interpretation discussion, and then discuss some of the implications for future. So first, these were the 2 research questions that I asked of my dissertation work. And we're going to focus on the first question, which are how are educators incorporated into accreditation review processes established and administered by NAIS, that's the National Association of Independent Schools, certified accreditation agencies. I'm coming at this from a positionality as an educator. This is my 13th year teaching. Time goes quick. I've taught in public school for 7 years in New York City, in Brooklyn, and now I'm teaching in Hershey for, this is my 6th year. Time goes quick. And in terms of my epistemological framework, I'm approaching this one as a social constructivist. And a lot of that develops as how I teach. This form of, teacher-centered instruction. That's not how I teach at all. I like bringing voice to my students, and I try to do that through my research, create meaning through dialogue. The chief concept of inquiry that I looked at was accreditation as a process to assure quality assurance and institutional improvement. The important thing to remember about independent schools is they are separate from government in general. Government funding, government supervision, government everything. So in other words, they have to govern themselves. And they really do this through their associations with accreditation agencies. I did a qualitative case study. My population in total was 156 educators that really spanned across 8 schools across the country. So each of the schools had a different regional accreditation body. What really bound them together was that the agencies were all certified by the National Association of Independent Schools. I offered first surveys to 156 people, and I used criterion and random sampling at those schools. And then I offered those who participated in the survey, if they wanted to sit down for an interview through Zoom, I used convenience sampling for that. I asked, are you interested? Do you want to do this? And then I reached out to those individuals. In total, I received about 168, I think, the numbers in the dissertation itself, surveys, and through blank surveys that I received or they timed out, I disregarded those that were completely blank. And then for interviews, I received 20 individuals who wanted to be interviewed or had expressed interest. And I sent them emails saying, hey, would you like to sit down and talk with me? And 8, I actually sat down and discussed a little bit more of their experiences. So I really focused on lived experiences. And in large part, a lot of the low participation rate there was the timing of the study. The email was sent out at the end of May, when a lot of teachers had one foot out the door for summer vacation. And I did the interviews in mid to late June and through July. And I think the last interview I did was in September. So today's focus I'm going to look at are specific perceptions of leadership styles. And one of the things that is interesting, and this is one of the first of my 5 themes that I found, is this dichotomy. And I've been struggling with it ever since I actually wrote it, trying to make meaning, trying to create a sense of why did I get such opposite ends of the spectrum? And I think a lot of that starts with the National Association of Independent Schools. Because this is a national agency, it's trying to be all-encompassing, but it's also trying, in effect, to be very flexible. And one of the things I really thought was interesting was in their 15th standard for their self-study of institutions, they said that a broad cross-section of the community should participate and must participate in preparing the self-study, but it never discusses how. And then in the 17th standard, it also says that it has to be deliberative. I have a laser pointer, okay? And that deliberation, again, there's no directions on what that deliberation should look like or how it should be conducted. So there leaves room for a lot of interpretation. Let's step back.
If you want to step back a bit, yeah.
Sorry, people seeing like my...
I know, sorry.
So that said, the first finding that I have found with regards to that first question about teacher perceptions is that it's widely accepted that there's an element of inclusivity. In particular, so looking at some survey data, 40% of my participants felt that they had opportunities or they had experiences where they openly provided feedback to institutional leaders about the organization. 35% engaged in professional development of some capacity, and 38% actually rewrote curricula that these are teachers, classroom teachers that conducted with this. And then in terms of the reforms that resulted from accreditation, the results were a little bit higher even. So almost 60% claim they served on a committee that's specific to a particular reform. 38.5% participated in professional development seminars resulting from accreditation results, and 32% consulted with administration about specific reforms that need to be made. I'm not going to read all of these to you. I'm just going to highlight some of the larger things. In terms of the interview data, and I use semi-structured interviews for these, so participants really drove that process, especially as we started talking. You can see that there were elements of collaboration and this element of what I call togetherness that really undergirded a lot of the attitudes towards accreditation. Beth here talks about addressing questions 2 to 3 faculty members in a group, and they moved from table to table. Samuel openly said, everyone is going to participate. Whether you want to or not, everyone plays a role, especially in the self-study portion. In terms of togetherness, Jason talked about, you know, oftentimes in independent schools, employees feel very siloed off because they're in their own world, their own office, their own function in the organization. And accreditation is an opportunity to bring those silos down and everybody coming together. Julia talks about coming together and deliberating. William talked about, and these are pseudonyms, by the way, talked about, again, coming together. And Kevin talked about pulling large groups of focus together to provide feedback. So we know there's inclusivity, but what does that inclusivity look like was really where we get a little bit of an inconsistency. On the one hand, there is a clear evidence of a top-down approach, where administration provided directives and stakeholders underneath, namely teachers, followed orders and waited for commands. William talked about it's the head of the school. It's a decision what the goals are going to be, and we're going to help carry those out. Samuel said, you know, it starts with the head. This is what we need to do, and we're going to do it. Melissa had a very interesting experience. She actually served on a committee that wrote the mission statement. The faculty all supported that mission statement, and then the head of school said no and just altered it unilaterally. Very undemocratic. Again, this is independent school world. And finally, in Beth's case, waiting on where are we going to go from here? We know this is what the results are. What are the directives going to be? How do you want me to proceed from here? Was a basic feeling about now that accreditation is over, where do we go? At the same time, participants also mentioned this being a bottom-up experience filled with empowerment, okay? There was about 19% of participants, they checked off a box saying they had a position of leadership, whether it be a committee chair, whether it be providing feedback, whether it be chairing the entire accreditation for the school. And then the 15% actually led professional development sessions. When I actually did the interviews, I got a little bit more ideas to what do those look like. William, the interim head of school, actually said, do you want to run accreditation? And he said, yes, he's a classroom teacher. He never did it before this. First year, he said, was a mess. But he learned from there, and now he's the accreditation expert. In terms of Beth, she helped the school director design faculty meetings around what accreditation should be and how, and its benefits. And Alan actually says, hey, this is my chief responsibility. I actually redesigned, he was an English educator, he said, I redesigned the curriculum based on accreditation and based on this open sphere where they said, hey, you know, let's work together and really kind of take a position of leadership. Here's the curriculum, you write it, you're responsible for it. So what this actually relates to the question, if we bring it all together, is that we have a dualistic organizational philosophies at play here. On the one hand, there is a strict hierarchy that's shown, whereas at the top, administrators are the gatekeepers. This is what the focus is going to be. This is what the delegated roles for the rest of the organization are going to be. Let's carry it out. Teachers were very subordinate. They looked up to their administrators for direction. I think you especially saw that on the previous slide. Yeah, with Beth, where she said, you know, we haven't received any type of directive. At the same time, there's another hierarchy, which I actually label it as more of an equality piece, where administrators and teachers really broke down those traditional hierarchical barriers and worked together. There was an attitude that, hey, we're working towards the same goal. And there's a time to be open and honest. Every one of my participants stressed honesty is the best approach to accreditation for two reasons. One, this is a process aimed to help. It's not a gotcha process. And two, if you're trying to hide something, the process will weed it out. They will find it and it looks bad. So they thought that this dialogue, this open and honest dialogue really was important regardless of roles. And finally, it was a chance to assume non-traditional leadership positions in the school. Being a chair of an accreditation. Well, everybody looks at you, whether you're going to be the teacher, the classroom teacher, or you're going to be the head of school. You're in charge of the entire accreditation process. So coming off of this, and this is the implications piece, and this is where I think it's really interesting, is that accreditation agencies, they almost would benefit from continually examining its requirements. In terms of, hey, is this the kind of inclusion we want? Do we want one philosophy over the other? Do we want schools to actually determine their own course of action? To determine, hey, what are our desires? And are our standards matching that desire? For independent school leaders, this kind of highlights a wonderful opportunity to really see if there's a cognitive dissonance almost in their own practices. What is their outlook in the process? Does your intentions match your actual actions? Do you intend to be more empowering, but you're actually more top down? Or vice versa? And in terms of for researchers, the interesting thing about independent school accreditation is there really are no studies about it. It's very political and talks about some sensitivity, and accreditation does provide a lot of independent schools some form of legitimacy to the outside community. So for a researcher to come in and say, hey, I'm researching this, can be very intimidating. That said, the possibilities are endless. Two of the things that we could do from what I found here is looking at accreditation outside of independent schools. What does it look like in higher education? How does it compare and contrast? Should the process in higher ed model more the independent schools, or should independent school accreditation model more of what's going on in higher education? And that side-by-side comparison allows for more sharing and probably a little bit more, even more so, alignment between a primary, secondary, and post-secondary education institutions. And finally, I would really like to, in the future, take a study design very similar to this and see what's going on in the public sphere. You know, is this idea, are these feelings, these attitudes about accreditation, this dualistic top-down approach, are they applying to how public schools are assessed? And also, could we take an accreditation model, which is very much so steeped in not so much a gotcha or you have to meet minimum benchmarks, but more so, what's your mission? Are you achieving the mission? Where do you want to be 10 years from now? And how can we help you get there? Very much so growth oriented. Would that work in a public sphere? And if it does, what would that look like to the future of public education? So in many ways, you could really, this study, you can take it anywhere. Possibilities are really endless. And these are just some of the references that I used. I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
Did you see the tension between those two philosophies at each of the sites, or were there some sites that really just embraced one?
So the interesting thing was I didn't have research sites. I actually didn't go to the schools because they're all across the country. Interestingly, when I actually was coding the data and I'm looking at each individual transcript, there were highlights of both throughout. So each school kind of does it differently. And it's one of the interesting things about independent schools is that each community is drastically different. So the actual assessment piece is very individualistic to the actual school and its mission. despite that, this kind of dualistic philosophy did actually exist in pretty much every single interview that I conducted. Yes?
Did you find that, that there was a lean to hierarchy or equality based on the educator had a leadership role within the university, or sorry, within the school?
So I have to repeat the question, right? You
Please,
wanted me to
for the
repeat?
online.
Okay. Sorry, everyone online. So you're asking me if I found if there was a lean towards one or the other?
Based on educator leadership. You said they self-identified that there was like 20 or 40%.
So there was a little bit of there probably was a little bit of a lean. I found that more, if you were closer to an administrative piece or more of a leadership role, you tend to talk a little bit more about it being kind of bottom up. Whereas I think teachers, if you were just serving on a committee or if you, just was more of the run-of-the-mill non-leadership role, but you participated, there was a little bit more of a top-down that was felt. Despite that, there was references to both throughout. I mean, it really wasn't that much of a lead. Yes? I'm just going to grab my water.
That the admin, the leadership in the buildings wanted the process to be more empowered with the staff, and that the staff felt like the process was more top-down.
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said something that might seem obvious, and that is you're an administrator in the building, and you try to do an accreditation, you got to get through the accreditation process. You'd like to empower your staff to be part of the accreditation process for a number of reasons. First, you want them to have ownership over the process. Having ownership over the process means they're going to do the work and they have ownership over it, and so you'd like them to be empowered to have ownership over it and to do the work because the advocates can't do all the work in the accreditation process.
Sure.
It would be overwhelming. So they split up those responsibilities. So if what you said is true, and that is that the admin leans more toward empowerment, one would expect that because they would need it. And at the same time, the staff, the faculty, would see this process as coming from leadership because it is.
Yeah.
Because the leadership is saying, we need to get accredited, and you need to help with that.
No, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, the process itself does start at the head of the school's desk. From there, however, after it's delegated, is really where you begin to see some of the conflicting perspective. Some heads of school take a more hands-on role because there's either a fear of, hey, if we don't do well on here, what's the greater community going to think? Whereas I think others feel comfortable to kind of let loose the reins.
So let me ask you another question.
Sure.
Would other future research be concerned about school climate and school health to see in an evaluation of school climate, health, and culture if one type of school climate and health led to more successful accreditation application processes?
Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful study to kind of bridge off of this. One of the concerning elements to all of this kind of research with accreditation, and then you're going to tie in some school health and school culture. One of the biggest concerns I think a lot of schools will have in participating in that are the politics surrounding it. One of the things that I learned very quickly early on is even doing a study like this, where I just wanted to see what teacher perceptions were, I did get a decent amount of pushback from an accrediting body and also from an institution. So in terms of adding in now school climate, yeah, I would love to see that. The question is, how open will an independent school setting be to hosting a research like that? I'm sure there are schools out there, but it will take work.
There's a whole website of school climate culture and health tools that by the name of And they could be distributed and have been anonymously to get a first reading of school health and culture. You could also do some observations that school climate health and culture
Sure.
as well. That would probably decrease the amount of bias and give you fairly accurate representation of that school. So
Yeah.
it'd be an interesting line of research because it would inform future schools.
Yeah.
What the process might look like, they can have an idea about the school, like a school health index sort of rating.
And another kind of, I was just thinking about it, another good kind of offshoot of that is, at a lot of independent schools, some of the people even said this who visited on visiting teams when they went to schools. They'll sit down for interviews with teachers and they say, "Oh, how is everything?" And they say, "Oh, it's great, it's fantastic, it's wonderful." And then they kind of just nod at them and say, "Oh, okay, we know what's really going on here." So judging, kind of adding that little nuance as well, I think would also really bridge this a little bit more.
I'm going to actually respond a little bit to that with my question,
Yeah.
Which is, and I have knowledge of the process because I was on the committee. And I actually think it was very challenging to get the kinds of data you're asking for, which is why I think this study is so particularly special and unique. It's very difficult to study the accreditation process as an outsider because with IRB, we need either the permission of the accrediting body, and they're not willing to see these kinds of studies take place, or we need the heads of school permission, and then you're only going to get the kinds of schools that feel confident with their accrediting process and might favor the more democratically organized system. So with that background, what did you expect and what were you most surprised at in the findings? Or where did you come from in terms of wanting to do this and what were you surprised at?
So as an independent school teacher, I have not been, before when I actually did collect my data, haven't been through the accreditation process yet, actually. Now that I've kind of seen it from a teacher lens at my institution, the thing that probably I expected, I actually thought it would be very much so teachers complaining about the process because of the workload. And what I actually found was that element was there. However, there was not a single participant who thought that this was not a worthwhile process. Overwhelmingly, teachers said, hey, honesty is important. Inclusion in this process is important of all stakeholders. And really, we should use this for growth. And one of the interesting things I found about this process was, when I started, I thought that this would be very much so, okay, here is a list of standards. How are you meeting X, Y, and Z? And what I found was it's a very fluid process that's very specific to each school. It's a very moldable process. And what that actually creates is not necessarily one form of assessment, but you take every single independent school accredited in the country, that's how many forms of assessment actually occur. So that was one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting. Going into it, I knew this was going to be very political, a very politically charged study. What I also didn't realize was how political it would get for my institution, which was about to go through accreditation, and for the accrediting body for the state. So it was for that reason that I actually didn't include my own school, or I didn't include Pennsylvania's accrediting body, which, how political it got, I really wasn't expecting that. But what I actually did find was, at the end of the day, the results I found actually came out to say, hey, this is actually an incredible form of assessing institutional performance and institutional future as well, which I actually didn't expect to be so much on the accreditation bandwagon now than I would have been when I initially did the research.
Any last questions? Online? No, online. Great, thank you so much, both Chris. Just a reminder that both of our presenters today have prepared or are preparing policy briefs that will be available on the website, as well as a recording from this presentation today. And then our next event come back on January 10th. I don't remember who's presenting, but if anyone knows, I'll shout it out. Yay. Okay, Mark. And I don't know who else is presenting, but anyway, come back next month. We're happy to see you. And if you'd like to hear a little bit more of the off the record information about how these projects take place and what's going on, please stay and talk to both Chris and Amanda. Thank you again. And recording?
Thank you.